As you gather together as a family for dinner one evening, your little one, who's only about 6, decides to sit at the head of the table. I don't know if at your table you generally have seats of position, but let's say you do in this case. And as you come, Dad, or if whoever is the head of the household, comes along and sits in their head of the table seat, you notice your little 6-year-old looking up, smiling, big grin, as if he's kind of joking. But you wonder if in the back of this little boy's mind, he's actually hoping to be the head of the table for the night. I think in our day and age, we would say that's cute. There's no harm in that at all. And who knows, maybe the child is being innocent. Although in our previous couple videos, what do we see? They're spiritually blind by their sinful nature. Their hearts are very dark because, well, they have our human hearts too. And they're lost. So even though it might be a little bit of a joke, there's a huge issue that's going on that often plays itself out in various ways that are very evident to see that there's some sinfulness going on. And it's all around the idea of authority, the idea of authority. So I want to start with this idea about the head of the table, which is really reserved by God for fathers. And if the father's spiritually absent, then the mother becomes the spiritual head of the household or a guardian. But whatever the case, it's never a child's place to be the authority in the house. Although a child will often act different and suggest otherwise because of their nature. We need to point this out to them too. So here is the biblical principle that we're dealing with here as we sit down and as we recognize who truly is the head of the household, the head of the table. 1 Corinthians 11:3 says, I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. The ultimate authority, the ultimate head over everything is God. And in this life, God, for his purposes, for our blessing, has given various authorities. We even think about this authority being established in one of the commandments from the Lord God. Honor your father and mother, that it may go well with you, that you might live long on the earth. That is a commandment for children especially, but of course it applies to any of us who are under authority, and we're all under someone's authority, especially that of God's. So go back to your family table. There you see your little boy smiling up at you, wanting to be the head of the household, wanting to call the shots, if you will, to sit at the head of the table. Now, lovingly, you say, nope, there's your seat. You'll sit there tonight. And hopefully, they'll abide and go on. If not, there's an opportunity for a conversation, an ongoing conversation, all about a process to examine what's going on in the heart when a child tries to usurp a parent's authority. And this happens all the time. Counselors are bombarded with parents who don't know what to do with their child. They're at their wits' end because their child just won't listen. Whether it deals with the issues of bedtime, how much screen time they can have, whether they want to eat their peas or not, whether they want to tie their own shoes or not, clean their room for what reason or whatever. All of this stuff comes back to this idea of authority and its extension of their lostness. In the previous video, we talked about their sense of autonomy and self-sufficiency. Well, that all extends from this idea that they want to be their own authority. And what we want to do as parents is to let them know that they're always going to be under authority. Even if they would become the president of the United States of America, they will always live under God's authority. And authority is good. We've really lost that, in my opinion, today. I mean, the fact that we allow children to call adults just by their first name. Because, well, who are we to be above them? I get that. I understand that. Before God, we're all equal. But it is for their blessing, a child's blessing for their well-being, that they recognize there are authorities that God gave over them to keep them safe and secure, that they ought to abide by, to listen to, obey, so that they don't lose their life. So this is really an important matter. And I wanted to give you some thoughts about this idea of living under authority and why it's so important. When you're dealing with your children's actions, and if you ever feel at times that they're beyond your control and they just don't listen to you anymore, we should recognize it's not just because they're strong-willed. It's not just some outward behavior that they've gotten into, which hopefully they'll grow out of. It's always a matter of the heart. And the younger they are, the more of a chance we have to instill in them that authority is always over them, and it is good. It's beautiful. We don't want to be having authority battles with a 17-year-old. Right? And a lot of parents end up facing that. Now, there's hope. There's always rescue if we have these open conversations and we talk about grace in God's law and his design and why it's so beautiful. But a lot of times we kind of bypass this. It's a war of the wills. And parents let the kids have it and they threaten, and the kids become more resistant and stubborn, and they threaten back or they fight back and they demand to have authority. Do we parents recognize that according to the sinful nature, in every instance where there's rebellion against authority, parental authority, that little child of yours, that child of mine, is saying that they are the Lord Jesus Christ, and that they ought to be the center of your universe, that they ought to sit at the head of the table, and that they know better than you. Do you see the whole issue there? That's a problem that is a spiritual root. In fact, that sin is a lot like that of the devil's. The devil didn't want to live under God's authority. So he went to war to get God's throne, and thankfully, God prevailed. So, the importance of addressing that self-ruled will of your child's heart, it really is essential. And I want to leave you some thoughts here. One gospel thought, 2 Corinthians 5:15. It's just a beautiful passage that reminds us all that we all are to live under authority, under God's authority. That includes parents and children and church leaders, anyone who believes in Jesus. It's God's design for the whole world. What is that passage, 2 Corinthians 5:15? Jesus died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves. Let me say that again. He died for all, that those who live might not any longer live for themselves, but they would submit to the authority that's over them. That's what the gospel creates in us, that understanding like, oh, he's the authority. I am blessed when I live under him, because then my life never ends. And I should respect all those in authority over me too. And I need to teach my children to do the same. When I also recognize that by nature, their hearts are far from that. They want to be their own God. So, parents, that means you can't just exercise your authority over your child. We want to paint God's authority as beautiful, and God's authority is given to you to protect your child, to give them grace, to open their eyes to their sinfulness, to point out their lostness, their autonomous nature, and their self-sufficiency, which will only lead them astray, and that they want to be their own authority. That's the authority God gave you. So we don't want to just run roughshod over our children. If we ever say, you'll do that because I told you so, we are abusing our authority, aren't we? We're not painting it as beautiful. We do owe it to our children to share with them the beauty behind why it's important for them to listen to us. And if anything, God, who died for them, establish your authority over that child for their benefit. They need to understand that. And the only way that happens is by confronting, finding that opportunity when they won't go to bed, when they're rebelling against your authority, to sit down with them in all compassion, patience, telling them why you have authority over them. And it's for their benefit, their blessing. Giving them the gospel, forgiving them, and then showing them the consequences of rebelling against authority. Consequences which will be far better than when they get out in the world and they rebel against authority that can put them to death. And in some cases, they can, or they can live such foolish, rebellious lives that naturally they die. Death will be their teacher. You don't want death to be their teacher. That's what's headed for a child that's unruly, that rejects authority. So we never want to exercise our authority in an abusive sense by saying things when we find them rebelling, saying things like, "What are you, stupid? You're not going to listen to your dad. I'm your father and you're going to do what I'd say." Or if they ever accuse you of not knowing anything, you can say, well, something like, well, I've forgotten far more than you'll ever know, as if you are deserving of the authority over you. The thing with authority is we don't, as parents, deserve to have authority over anyone. No one in government does, no one in the church does. But God, by his grace, elevates people to authority. And in the wisdom God has given us as parents, which people maybe generally, naturally can gravitate toward, children are blessed to have overseers. But it's on that basis that God, who died for them, has given me authority over you. And it's important for you to recognize that and respect that. Otherwise, you're going to hurt yourself. And I don't want you to be hurt. Parents must help their children understand that they have a tendency to rebel against authority. That sitting in the head chair for the table, that might seem like a little joke, but there could be a serious side behind it. They should know that their automatic instinct is to rebel. They should also understand that this authority established in the home is authority that God has given. And if children understand that early on, then you won't have these rebellion battles later on, at least not to that extent, not when they're severe and it's hard to overcome because they're almost adults. We want to speak then with grace throughout, with the gospel as the basis for why God establishes authority over all people. It's to bless us, to save us. That's one of the biggest issues I think people have with authority today. They think that people in authority are simply there to rule over them, to get in it and out of it what is good and best for them. That is not God's desire for those who are in authority. And any Christian parent should be able to articulate that. Finally, a couple thoughts. Are you consistent in exercising authority that is shown to be God's authority over your children? Or do you fall back into your own default setting of saying, hey, I'm your dad, do what I say because I told you to? Do you also confess that when it comes to authority, that you're more like your children than they're different from you? Whenever you see your child acting out in rebellion, it is good to humble yourself and say, look, I get why you're doing what you're doing. Do you know, I also balk at rebellion or authority. I also rebel. I also like to let people who are in charge know I don't care for them so much, critique them, suggest that I should be in their seat. I do that even with God. With that, we're able to expose the darkness that is there in our heart. And with that, with compassion, we can come alongside our child and say, this is why we need Jesus. And aren't you glad that he's in authority over us? He rules over all things. Why? To bless you with forgiveness that you might live. If you ascend to the throne of God and sit there, you will die, just as the devil has been sentenced to be apart from God forever and is pure evil. That's where rebellion leads. To have such deep theological conversations, to open the eyes of your child's heart so that they might truly see what a blessing it is to be under authority. You know, in discussion of authority, talking about the cross of Jesus Christ, it's everything. And it's the exact gospel that we want to work into the hearts of our children. Think about this. If Jesus came and died to break the bondage of our hearts and our children's hearts to this idea of independent authority, and in so doing rescued us, then it would not be weird to talk about how Jesus is the authority over their life. And he did that so that we would give up on having authority that only God has. And in that we find life. This is one of the encouragements, themes that we're working with in these videos too. If we think it's strange to talk about Jesus at the table or in our life, then we truly don't understand how important, essential it is, and how much Christ applies to parenting. So we'll talk about this more as we continue our discussions on what our children really need to learn in upcoming videos. We'll be talking a little bit about foolishness next time, which is always on display, even at the family table. God's blessings then as you grow in your knowledge of God and in Christian parenting.